annual summer fete at St. Mildred's had achieved that perfect balance of organised chaos that marked all successful village events. Bunting fluttered bravely in the afternoon breeze, the brass band from Lower Paddington played with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and the scent of Mrs. Dollop's famous jam tarts mingled pleasantly with the aroma of freshly cut grass and prize-winning roses. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly in the shade of the ancient oak tree, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm as she observed the familiar tableau of village life unfolding before her. At 74, she had attended enough fêtes to recognise the subtle dramas playing out among the stalls. Young Mr. Pembridge's obvious infatuation with the new postmistress, Mrs. Weatherby's barely concealed fury at losing the jam competition yet again, and the vicar's wife's valiant attempts to prevent the tombola prizes from being examined too closely before purchase. "Such a lovely turnout," remarked Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling into the chair beside her with a slight grunt of satisfaction. "Though, I must say, it feels rather strange having festivities so soon after poor Mrs. Hartwell's passing. Still, she would have wanted the fete to continue. Always said tradition was more important than sentiment." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Constance Hartwell had indeed been a formidable woman, ruling her considerable household and charitable endeavours with the efficiency of a general and the determination of a saint. Her death 3 days earlier, though not unexpected given her age and recent frailty, had cast a respectful shadow over the village's preparations. "I understand the funeral is this afternoon," Miss Marple observed, glancing toward the church where Mr. Grimsdale's hearse would soon arrive. "A private service, I believe?" "Yes, just family and close friends. That nephew of hers, James, came down from London yesterday. Looked rather green about the gills, if you ask me. Never did have much stomach for family obligations." Mrs. Bantry's voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone who had correctly predicted years of poor character development. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the church gates. The funeral cortege had arrived precisely on schedule, the black hearse gleaming in the afternoon sun as it drew to a dignified halt. Mr. Grimsdale, the village undertaker, emerged with his customary solemnity, directing his assistants with practised efficiency. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the small gathering of mourners. James Hartwell, a pale young man whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise his nervous fidgeting. Miss Dorothy Vale, Mrs. Hartwell's long-time companion, standing rigidly upright despite her obvious grief. Doctor Haydock, looking professionally grave, and several other familiar faces from the village's more respectable circles. The hearse doors opened with ceremonial precision, revealing the polished oak coffin within. Mr. Grimsdale personally supervised its removal, his face bearing the expression of professional sympathy perfected over decades of practice. The small procession moved toward the church entrance, where the vicar waited with appropriate solemnity. It was then that something went wrong. Mr. Grimsdale, preparing for the final viewing before the service, approached the coffin with his customary reverence. His hands, steady from years of practice, lifted the polished lid. What followed was a moment of such profound silence that even the brass band seemed to falter mid-note. "I beg your pardon," Mr. Grimsdale said, in a voice that had lost all its professional composure. "But there appears to be, that is to say—" James Hartwell stepped forward impatiently. "What is it, man?" "We haven't got all day." Mr. Grimsdale's face had gone the colour of old parchment. "The coffin, sir." It's empty." The words hung in the afternoon air like an accusation. Miss Dorothy Vale made a small, strangled sound. Dr. Haydock moved quickly to peer into the coffin, his medical training overriding social convention. James Hartwell's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. "Empty?" The vicar's voice cracked slightly. "But surely there must be some mistake." "No mistake, Doctor," Haydock confirmed grimly. "The coffin is completely empty." News travelled through the fete with the speed of summer lightning. Conversations halted mid-sentence, children stopped their games to stare, and the brass band finally gave up all pretense of playing. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around the church, drawn by that peculiar magnetism that accompanies any deviation from normal village routine. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair, her knitting forgotten. She moved through the crowd with the gentle persistence of flowing water, her observant eyes taking in every detail. The genuine shock on Mr. Grimsdale's face, the way James Hartwell's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, Miss Vale's rigid composure that suggested iron self-control, and most interestingly the small piece of garden twine caught on the coffin's brass handle. "Most peculiar," she murmured to herself, noting also the faint scent of roses that seemed to cling to the empty coffin's satin lining. Not the heavy, cloying odour of funeral flowers, but something fresher, more alive. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his usual air of harried competence somewhat strained by the unusual nature of the case. As he began his preliminary investigation, Miss Marple retreated to her observation post beneath the oak tree, her mind already turning over the curious details like pieces of a complex puzzle. An empty coffin was certainly dramatic, but in Miss Marple's experience the most interesting questions were often the simplest ones. Not where Mrs. Hartwell's body had gone, but why someone had wanted it to disappear in the first place. The summer fete continued around them, but the carefree atmosphere had evaporated like morning mist. In its place was something far more intriguing, the delicious uncertainty that comes when ordinary people discover that their neighbours might not be quite as ordinary as they had supposed. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and began a new row, her needles clicking softly as she watched the drama unfold. After all, the best mysteries, like the finest gardens, required patience and careful tending to reveal their secrets. The silence that followed Mr. Grimsdale's announcement stretched like a held breath across the churchyard. Then, as if a dam had burst, the whispers began, low at first, then rising to an urgent murmur that spread through the fete with the speed of summer lightning. Stalls were abandoned mid-transaction, the brass band faltered to a discordant halt, and even the children sensed something momentous had occurred, their games forgotten as they pressed closer to their parents. Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes, his motorcar announcing itself with a series of authoritative backfires that seemed to underscore the gravity of the situation. He was a stocky man with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to imposing order on chaos, though Miss Marple noted a certain tightness around his eyes that suggested this particular chaos was rather outside his usual experience. "Right then," he announced, surveying the scene with professional skepticism. "Let's have some facts. Mr. Grimsdale, I'll start with you." The undertaker's composure, already severely tested, crumbled further under official scrutiny. His neat black gloves trembled as he recounted the morning's events, the collection of Mrs. Hartwell from her home Tuesday evening, the proper preparation at his establishment, the sealing of the coffin at 11 o'clock sharp, with 2 assistants present as witnesses. The coffin was not left unattended at any point, Mr. Grimsdale insisted, his professional pride warring with his bewilderment. "We took the lane behind the vicarage to avoid the fete crowds, arrived directly at the church and waited by the south gate until the vicar signalled. I simply cannot explain how this has happened." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself where she could observe without appearing to intrude, noticed several details that seemed to escape the inspector's attention. The faint green smudge along the coffin's satin lining, barely visible unless one knew where to look. The lingering scent of roses, not the heavy perfume of funeral flowers, but something fresher, more alive, and most intriguingly the small piece of garden twine caught on the brass handle, so ordinary it might have been overlooked entirely. Meanwhile, the village had begun its own investigation through the time-honoured method of speculation and gossip. Mrs. Weatherby, never one to let a crisis pass without commentary, had appointed herself chief theorist. "Body snatchers," she declared with ghoulish satisfaction to her growing audience. "You read about such things in the papers. Wicked men who steal corpses for medical experiments. Though why they'd want poor Mrs. Hartwell is beyond me. She was hardly in her prime." "Nonsense," retorted Mr. Pembridge, emboldened by the drama. "It's insurance fraud, mark my words. I saw something similar at the pictures. People fake their deaths to collect the money. Very modern crime, that is." Dr. Haydock, overhearing this exchange while waiting to give his statement to Inspector Slack, shook his head with professional disapproval. "Absolute rubbish. I signed the death certificate myself. Mrs. Hartwell died of heart failure, as natural as breathing." There was nothing suspicious about her passing. Yet Miss Marple observed that the doctor's usual composure seemed strained. his hands clasped too tightly behind his back, his gaze avoiding the empty coffin with what might have been distaste or guilt. The most persistent theory, however, centred on family discord. James Hartwell's financial difficulties were common knowledge in a village where privacy was a luxury few could afford. His gambling debts, his infrequent visits to his aunt, and most damning of all, the blazing row that had concluded his last visit 3 weeks ago, made him a natural focus for suspicion. "Never did have any proper feeling for family," Mrs. Dollop observed darkly, abandoning her jam-tart stall to join the speculation. "And with Mrs. Hartwell's will, well, money does terrible things to people's consciences." James himself seemed acutely aware of the scrutiny. He stood apart from the main group, lighting cigarette after cigarette with hands that shook noticeably. When Inspector Slack called him forward for questioning, his responses were clipped and defensive, doing little to dispel the growing suspicion surrounding him. "I arrived from London yesterday evening," he insisted. "Last saw my aunt 3 weeks ago. And yes, we had words about my circumstances, but I was at my club when she died. Dozens of witnesses can confirm it." Miss Dorothy Vale presented a striking contrast to James's obvious agitation. Mrs. Hartwell's companion for 15 years stood with rigid composure, her grief controlled but evident in the tight line of her mouth and the way her gloved hands gripped her reticule. She answered Inspector Slack's questions with precise efficiency, confirming that she had packed Mrs. Hartwell's burial clothes and sent them to Mr. Grimsdale as previously arranged. "Mrs. Hartwell disliked fuss," Miss Vale explained, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Everything was planned according to her wishes." Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by Miss Vale's unwavering loyalty. 15 years of devoted service created bonds that could be stronger than blood, and loyalty pushed to extremes could become something else entirely. She watched as Miss Vale's eyes followed Tom Fletcher's movements with an intensity that seemed to go beyond casual interest. Tom Fletcher, Mrs. Hartwell's gardener, stood at the very edge of the crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. He was a man more at home with soil and growing things than with the complexities of human drama, his weathered hands fidgeting with his cap as Inspector Slack questioned him about his whereabouts. "Came in early to tend the roses," he explained, his voice barely above a mumble. Mrs. Hartwell was particular about them. Left at 8 when Miss Vale said the undertakers would be along. Miss Marple noted the garden twine wound around Tom's finger, ordinary green twine of the sort used for training climbers and supporting delicate stems. A small cut on his knuckle had left a smear that matched the faint mark she had observed on the coffin's satin lining. Innocent enough, perhaps, but in her experience innocent details often proved to be anything but. As the afternoon wore on and statements were taken, Inspector Slack's investigation began to focus on the most obvious suspect. James Hartwell's financial troubles, combined with his strained relationship with his aunt and his obvious nervousness, made him a natural target for official suspicion. "Family disputes," Slack confided to the vicar with grim satisfaction. "Always the same story when there's money involved. Mark my words, we'll have this sorted by evening." But Miss Marple, observing from her quiet corner beneath the oak tree, was not so certain. She had noticed that James's nervousness seemed to stem from genuine bewilderment rather than guilt, and his shock at the empty coffin had appeared entirely authentic. More intriguingly, she had observed the subtle interplay between the other members of Mrs. Hartwell's household, the way Miss Vale's composure never quite extended to her eyes, Doctor. Haydock's careful avoidance of certain questions, and Tom Fletcher's obvious discomfort with any mention of his morning routine. As the church clock struck 5 and the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The empty coffin still sat in the church porch, a silent accusation that someone in this peaceful village harboured secrets darker than anyone suspected. She thought of the rose scent lingering in the satin, the careful attention someone had paid to Mrs. Hartwell's garden even after her death, and the fierce loyalty she had observed in Miss Vale's steady gaze. "What a dreadful business," Mrs. Bantry sighed, settling beside her friend with the air of someone who had witnessed a particularly engaging theatrical performance. "What do you make of it all, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her fingers resuming their steady rhythm with the knitting needles. "People are very much like gardens, Dolly," she observed mildly. "They require the right conditions to flourish, and sometimes those conditions involve keeping certain things buried. The fete was winding down around them, but Miss Marple sensed that the real drama was only beginning. Somewhere in the tangle of relationships and loyalties that bound Mrs. Hartwell's household together lay the key to understanding not just where her body had gone, but why someone had wanted it to disappear in the first place. The following morning brought one of those crystalline summer days that seemed to mock the previous afternoon's drama. Miss Marple woke to birdsong and golden light, but her mind immediately returned to the puzzle of the empty coffin and those curious details that had caught her attention: the garden twine, the scent of roses, and the subtle tensions she had observed among Mrs. Hartwell's household. She was arranging her breakfast things when Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, appeared at her door with a basket of freshly cut sweet peas and an expression of determined sympathy. "Jane, my dear, I wonder if you might accompany me to Hartwell House this morning. Inspector Slack has given permission for someone to collect a few personal items for Miss Vale. The poor woman has nothing but what she was wearing yesterday. I confess I'd be grateful for the company. The whole business has left me rather unsettled." Miss Marple accepted the invitation with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose curiosity had been offered a perfectly legitimate outlet. Within the hour they were walking up the curved drive to Hartwell House, their footsteps crunching pleasantly on the well-maintained gravel. The house itself was a handsome Georgian manor, its red brick mellowed by age and softened by climbing roses that cascaded over the entrance porch in a profusion of cream and pink blooms. Miss Marple paused to admire them, noting their perfect condition despite their owner's recent death. "How lovely they are," she observed mildly. Mrs. Hartwell must have taken great pride in her garden. Inside, the hallway retained the hushed atmosphere of recent bereavement, yet Miss Marple's observant eyes immediately detected signs that all was not as it should be. The Persian runner showed scuff marks suggesting heavy items had been moved recently. A faint rectangular mark on the hall table indicated where something substantial had been removed, and there was a subtle displacement of furniture that spoke of hasty rearrangement rather than careful housekeeping. Mrs. Clement busied herself in Miss Vale's spartanly furnished room, selecting appropriate clothing, while Miss Marple examined the space with professional interest. On the small writing desk sat a half-finished letter, the ink still relatively fresh. "My dear Mrs. Hartwell has passed peacefully, and I find myself facing an uncertain future. After 15 years of devoted service, I must now consider—" The letter broke off mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted, or suddenly changed her mind. More intriguing were the medicine, bottles arranged with military precision on the washstand. Miss Marple recognized Dr. Haydock's neat labels, digitalis for Mrs. Hartwell's heart condition, and a bottle of chloral hydrate prescribed for sleep. But the dates were impossible. The sleeping draught bore yesterday's date, a full day after Mrs. Hartwell's supposed death. "How strange," Miss Marple murmured, examining the bottle more closely. The seal appeared intact, but the level of liquid seemed lower than one would expect from an unopened prescription. Mrs. Hartwell's bedroom revealed further contradictions. The bed had been stripped and remade with fresh linens, but the mattress showed indentations suggesting recent use. More telling was the faint scent of roses that lingered in the air, not the heavy perfume of cut flowers, but the living fragrance of blooms fresh from the garden. On the writing desk by the window, papers bore the look of interrupted intention. A half-finished letter in Mrs. Hartwell's firm hand began, "Dear Mr. Simmons, I have determined to make certain alterations to my previously expressed wishes. It is my conviction that conditions to burial must ensure—" The sentence ended abruptly, followed by a splatter of ink where the pen had been set down in haste. "I think we should look at the garden before we leave," Miss Marple suggested. Mrs. Hartwell's roses were so admired in the village. The garden was indeed spectacular, but it was not its beauty that captured Miss Marple's attention. It was the evidence of recent intensive care. The soil around prize-winning climbers had been freshly turned and watered. Spent blooms had been dead-headed with surgical precision, and new growth had been carefully tied to supporting stakes with green twine, identical to what she had noticed on Tom Fletcher's finger. Near the potting shed, she discovered further evidence: fresh tool marks in the soil, a wheelbarrow recently used and carefully cleaned, and most significantly, a small pile of garden lime that had been partially scattered. Lime improved soil conditions, but Miss Marple knew it had other properties that a knowledgeable gardener might find useful. "Someone has been working here very recently," she observed, kneeling to examine a specimen that showed signs of having been transplanted within the last few days. The roots were still settling, and the surrounding soil bore telltale marks of careful watering. Mrs. Clement looked puzzled. But surely Tom Fletcher wouldn't continue his work after Mrs. Hartwell's death? He was only employed by the day. Miss Marple stood slowly brushing soil from her gloves. Someone had indeed been tending this garden with the devotion of a true enthusiast, working with knowledge that could only come from years of intimate familiarity with each plant's needs. The precision of the work suggested that the garden held secrets beyond its obvious beauty. As they walked back to the village, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the curious contradictions they had encountered, a house showing signs of both hasty departure and careful preparation, a garden receiving devoted attention even after its owner's death, medicine bottles with impossible dates and letters breaking off at crucial moments. The empty coffin was merely the visible symptom of something far more complex. Someone in that quiet household had been making very careful preparations indeed, and the question was not simply where Mrs. Hartwell's body had gone, but why someone had needed it to disappear in the first place. "Such a devoted household," Mrs. Clement observed. "One can only hope they'll all find suitable positions elsewhere." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, "though I suspect some of them may find their futures rather more complicated than they anticipate." The morning's discoveries had raised more questions than answers, but Miss Marple was not discouraged. The most important clues were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with patience and insight to recognize their significance. The morning's discoveries at Hartwell House had left Miss Marple with more questions than answers, but the afternoon brought developments that seemed to clarify everything, or at least everything according to Inspector Slack's increasingly confident theory. The arrival of Mr. Simmons, Mrs. Hartwell's solicitor, on the 3:15 train from London carried with it the promise of revelation that the village had been anticipating since the shocking discovery of the empty coffin. Word of the solicitor's presence spread through St. Mildred's with the efficiency of a well-oiled telegraph system. By 4 o'clock, a small but significant gathering had assembled in the vicar's study, Inspector Slack with his notebook at the ready, the vicar himself looking appropriately grave, Mrs. Bantry representing the concerned community, and Miss Marple invited as a friend of the family and keen observer of human nature. Mr. Simmons was a precise man in his 60s, with the sort of methodical manner that suggested decades of handling delicate family matters. He arranged his papers with practised efficiency, adjusted his spectacles, and cleared his throat with the gravity befitting the occasion. "The matter of Mrs. Hartwell's will," he began, "is somewhat more complex than might initially appear. The primary document, executed 6 months ago, leaves the bulk of her considerable estate to her nephew, James Hartwell, with generous provisions for her companion, Miss Vale, and various charitable bequests." Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. "Straightforward enough. What's the complication?" "The complication, Mr." Simmons replied, producing a separate sheet of legal paper, "is a codicil added just 3 weeks ago. It introduces a most specific condition regarding Mr. Hartwell's inheritance." The room fell silent as he adjusted his spectacles and read, "The bequest to James. Hartwell shall be valid only upon the condition that the deceased, Mrs. Constance Hartwell, be interred in the family plot at St. Mildred's churchyard within 4 days of her death, according to the rites of the Church of England. Should this condition not be fulfilled, for any reason whatsoever, the residue of the estate shall pass in its entirety to the St. Mildred's Children's Home." The implications struck the assembled group like a physical blow. Mrs. Bantry gasped audibly, the vicar's eyebrows rose to unprecedented heights, and Inspector Slack's expression transformed into one of grim satisfaction. 3 weeks ago," the inspector repeated meaningfully. "That would coincide with James Hartwell's last visit to his aunt, wouldn't it?" "The visit where several witnesses heard raised voices?" Mr. Simmons nodded reluctantly. "Mrs. Hartwell was quite specific about informing her nephew of this condition. She felt it would provide what she termed proper motivation for responsible behaviour." Miss Marple, observing from her quiet corner, noted several interesting details that seemed to escape the others' attention. The timing of the codicil suggested careful planning rather than impulsive action. More intriguingly, she recalled the half-finished letter they had discovered at Hartwell House, where Mrs. Hartwell had begun to write about conditions to burial before breaking off abruptly. James Hartwell was summoned from his lodgings at the Rose and Crown, arriving pale and obviously distressed. When Mr. Simmons read the codicil aloud for his benefit, his reaction appeared genuine, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror as the full implications became clear. "She never mentioned the specific terms," he protested, his voice hoarse. "I knew she was displeased with me, but this is vindictive beyond belief." Inspector Slack studied him with professional interest. "Vindictive enough to drive a desperate man to desperate measures. You stand to lose everything if your aunt can't be buried in the family plot. The empty coffin ensures that burial cannot take place." "But that makes no sense," James exclaimed. "If I wanted the inheritance, I'd want her buried properly, not prevent it." "Unless," Slack continued relentlessly, "you removed the body to bury it secretly, establishing the fact of interment before any questions could be raised. A fait accompli that would satisfy the will's conditions." Miss Marple found this theory intriguing but incomplete. She thought of the freshly tended garden at Hartwell House, the medicine bottle with its impossible date, and the careful attention someone had paid to Mrs. Hartwell's prize roses, even after her supposed death. These details suggested a level of devotion and planning that seemed inconsistent with James's obvious distress and apparent lack of practical skills. "The physical evidence supports this theory," Inspector Slack continued, producing a small evidence bag. "This piece of garden twine was found on the coffin handle, identical to what's used throughout the Hartwell garden. Someone with access to that garden was involved in moving the body." Tom Fletcher, who had been quietly summoned to provide information about his morning routine, shifted uncomfortably when questioned about his early presence in the garden. His weathered hands showed the small cuts and stains consistent with heavy garden work, and Miss Marple noticed how his eyes kept drifting toward the window, as if drawn to growing things even in this moment of crisis. Miss Dorothy Vale, also present to clarify household arrangements, maintained her rigid composure throughout the proceedings. However, Miss Marple observed that her knuckles whitened whenever James's name was mentioned, and her responses about Mrs. Hartwell's final days carried an undertone of fierce protectiveness that seemed to extend beyond mere professional duty. Dr. Haydock, when questioned about his patient's final condition, confirmed that Mrs. Hartwell's death, while not unexpected given her age and heart condition, had come rather suddenly. "She seemed in reasonable spirits when I visited 2 days before her death. Certainly strong enough to tend her beloved roses and conduct her correspondence." This detail caught Miss Marple's attention. A woman strong enough to work in her garden and write letters was also strong enough to make decisions about her estate, or to discover that others were making decisions for her. As the evidence mounted against James Hartwell, Inspector Slack's confidence grew. "Motive, means, and opportunity," he declared with satisfaction. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of interfering with a burial and theft of a corpse." James's face went ashen as the handcuffs were produced. "This is madness," he whispered. "I may be a disappointment to my family, but I'm not a grave robber." As he was led away, still protesting his innocence, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting needles clicking thoughtfully. The case against James was certainly compelling. Too compelling, perhaps. In her experience, the most obvious suspect was often a convenient distraction from more complex truths. She thought of the devoted care someone had lavished on Mrs. Hartwell's garden, the impossible dates on medicine bottles, and the fierce loyalty she had observed in certain eyes. The empty coffin was merely the visible symbol of a much deeper mystery, one that involved love, loyalty, and the extraordinary lengths to which people would go to protect those they cherished. The village had found its culprit, and Inspector Slack was satisfied with his logical deduction. But Miss Marple knew that human nature was rarely so straightforward, and the truth, like the finest gardens, often required patience and careful tending to reveal its secrets. The arrest of James Hartwell had cast a peculiar shadow over St. Mildred's, one that seemed to satisfy Inspector Slack's need for resolution, while leaving an undercurrent of unease among those who knew the village's more subtle rhythms. The annual flower show, scheduled for the following afternoon, proceeded with that determined normalcy that characterized English village life in the face of scandal. After all, as Mrs. Weatherby declared with theatrical resolve, the show must go on, though her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had correctly predicted disaster. Miss Marple arrived at the village hall precisely at opening time, ostensibly to admire the prize-winning displays, but actually drawn by a growing certainty that the flower show would reveal more about the Hartwell mystery than Inspector Slack's confident arrest suggested. She moved through the exhibits with her characteristic gentle persistence, her observant eyes taking in every detail, while her knitting bag swung softly at her side. The rose display occupied the place of honour near the judge's table, and it was here that Miss Marple made her most significant discovery. Mrs. Hartwell's entries, submitted posthumously by her devoted household, were magnificent specimens that immediately drew admiring crowds. The blooms were perfect, Lady Hillingdon roses at the exact point of half-open perfection, Madame Alfred Carrière with petals like pale porcelain, and the rare souvenir de la Malmaison that had been Mrs. Hartwell's particular pride. But it was not their beauty that captured Miss Marple's attention, it was their condition. These roses had been cut that very morning. The stems showed clean, precise cuts of expert pruning, and the blooms themselves displayed the dewy freshness that could only come from immediate harvesting. More significantly, they showed evidence of meticulous care that characterized true expertise. Each bloom selected at the precise moment of perfection, each leaf positioned to maximum advantage. "Magnificent specimens," observed Dr. Haydock, appearing at her elbow with the slightly forced cheerfulness of someone determined to maintain normal social intercourse despite recent unpleasantness. Mrs. Hartwell would have been so pleased to see them take first prize. Miss Marple studied him with interest, noting how his gaze drifted toward Miss Dorothy Vale, who stood near the vegetable displays with the rigid posture of someone enduring a difficult social obligation. Indeed, someone has maintained them beautifully since her passing. Such devotion speaks well of her household's loyalty. The doctor's response was carefully neutral, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell taught me a great deal about roses during my visits. She believed that understanding plants was essential to understanding the human condition. Both require careful attention to thrive." This philosophical observation struck Miss Marple as highly significant. She approached Tom Fletcher, who hovered uncertainly near the entrance, clearly uncomfortable in the social atmosphere but drawn by professional interest to examine the horticultural displays. "Such beautiful roses," she remarked gently. "You must be very proud of your work with them." Tom's weathered face flushed with confusion. "Weren't my doing, miss. Haven't touched those roses since Tuesday morning when I left early on account of the undertaker's coming. Someone else has been seeing to them proper." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of discovery. If Tom had not tended the roses, who had maintained them in such perfect condition? The blooms displayed showed evidence of daily care, deadheading, watering, and the subtle adjustments that only came from intimate knowledge of each plant's requirements. She observed the subtle dynamics playing out among the remaining members of Mrs. Hartwell's household with growing fascination. Miss Vale moved through the displays with mechanical precision, accepting condolences with gracious efficiency, yet her eyes repeatedly returned to the rose display with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. There was a possessiveness in her glance, a carefully controlled emotion that spoke of deep personal investment. When the judging commenced, Mrs. Pembridge examined Mrs. Hartwell's entries with the thoroughness of an expert, noting details that escaped casual observers. "Extraordinary preservation," she announced. "These roses show no signs of stress or neglect. Someone has maintained them with remarkable skill. Look at this. The stems have been cut on the perfect bias, and there's even a trace of plant food solution in the water. This is the work of someone who truly understands roses." Miss Marple watched the reactions to this observation with keen interest. Tom Fletcher looked genuinely puzzled, confirming his earlier statement. Miss Vale's composure remained perfect, but Miss Marple detected a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested carefully controlled emotion. Most revealing was Dr. Haydock's response. His face showed a complex mixture of pride and anxiety, as if he were both pleased by the recognition of expert care and concerned about its implications. As the afternoon progressed and prizes were awarded, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that James Hartwell's arrest, while satisfying Inspector Slack's need for a logical solution, had merely scratched the surface of a much more complex truth. The empty coffin was not the result of desperate greed, but of something far more profound, a devotion so complete that it would risk everything to protect its object. The roses told their own story to those who knew how to read it. Someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's garden had continued to tend her beloved plants with the skill of a master and the devotion of a lover. The question was not who had the opportunity to steal a body, but who had the knowledge and dedication to maintain a perfect illusion while concealing a truth that ran deeper than mere inheritance disputes. As the flower show concluded and the village began to resume its normal rhythms, Miss Marple remained convinced that the real mystery was only beginning to unfold. The arrest of James Hartwell had provided a convenient conclusion for those who preferred simple explanations, but the roses themselves testified to a more complex truth, one that involved love, sacrifice, and the extraordinary lengths to which people would go to honour their deepest commitments. Walking home through the evening light, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The most important clues she had learned long ago were often hidden in plain sight, disguised by the very ordinariness of daily life, and few things were more ordinary or more revealing than a gardener's love for their roses. The revelations at the flower show had crystallized Miss Marple's growing certainty that the empty coffin represented something far more complex than Inspector Slack's tidy theory of inheritance fraud. The perfectly maintained roses spoke of a devotion that transcended ordinary service, and the subtle tensions she had observed among Mrs. Hartwell's household suggested relationships with roots that ran much deeper than anyone had suspected. Her opportunity to explore these suspicions came the following morning, when she encountered Mrs. Clement outside the post office, clutching a small bundle of letters with an expression of troubled uncertainty. "Jane, I wonder if you might advise me on a delicate matter. While helping Miss Vale pack her remaining belongings, I discovered these letters tucked behind a loose board in her wardrobe. They're addressed to Mrs. Hartwell, but they're quite old, from the war years. I feel I shouldn't have looked, but one fell open and—" She paused, clearly distressed. "They're love letters, Jane. Very passionate ones." Miss Marple accepted the bundle with appropriate gravity, noting immediately that the letters bore the postmark of a military hospital in Kent, and were signed, "Your devoted Arthur." The paper was yellowed with age, but the emotion in the carefully penned words remained vivid. Lieutenant Arthur Vale of the Royal West Kents had written to his dearest Constance with the fervour of a man who knew that each letter might be his last. "He writes of their secret engagement," Miss Marple observed, studying the dates. "And here he mentions his sister Dorothy, who was working as a nurse in London. He hopes that if anything happens to him, Dorothy will come to comfort Constance in her grief." The implications struck both women simultaneously. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. "Dorothy Vale. Miss Vale isn't just any companion. She's his sister, isn't she? She came to Mrs. Hartwell after her brother's death." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern that explained much about the fierce loyalty she had observed. Miss Vale's devotion to Mrs. Hartwell wasn't merely professional, it was a sacred trust, a promise made to a dying brother to care for the woman he loved. Armed with this knowledge, Miss Marple made her way to the Rose and Crown, where she found Tom Fletcher taking his midday meal in the public bar. The gardener looked up with the wary expression of a man who had been expecting unwelcome questions. "Mr. Fletcher," she began gently, settling into the chair across from him. "I've been thinking about those beautiful roses at the show. You mentioned that someone else had been tending them since Tuesday morning. I wonder if you might have noticed who that someone was." Tom's weathered hands tightened around his pint glass. After a long moment he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I seen things, miss. Things that aren't my business to tell. But if an innocent man hangs for what others done out of love—" He shook his head. "That ain't right either." Miss Marple waited patiently, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a simple pattern that required little attention. Tuesday night, after the undertakers took what they thought was Mrs. Hartwell, I couldn't sleep, worried about the roses, you see. They needed deadheading, and the weather'd been dry, so I walked over, quiet-like, just to check on them. He paused, taking a long draught of his beer. Saw lights in the house, and voices in the garden. Miss Vale was there, and Dr. Haydock. They had something heavy between them, wrapped in canvas, moving careful-like toward the potting shed. Miss Marple's needles never faltered, but her attention sharpened. Did you hear what they were saying? Bits and pieces. Miss Vale kept saying, "She made me promise, Doctor. She made me swear." And the doctor, he was arguing, saying it was madness, that they'd never get away with it. But she was fierce, miss. Said Mrs. Hartwell had suffered enough scandal in her life, and she wouldn't let her suffer it in death too. The picture was becoming clearer. Miss Marple thought of the medicine bottle with its impossible date, the freshly tended garden, and the half-finished letter they had discovered. Mrs. Hartwell had been planning something, and her devoted household had been helping her carry it out. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Haydock's surgery, ostensibly to have a small cut on her finger examined. The doctor attended to her with professional efficiency, but she noticed the tremor in his hands and the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Dr. Haydock," she said as he applied a small bandage, "I've been wondering about Mrs. Hartwell's final days. She seemed in such good spirits at the church fete just a week before her death. Quite remarkable for someone so ill." His hands stilled. "Mrs. Hartwell was a remarkable woman. She faced her final illness with extraordinary courage and dignity." "Yes, I'm sure she did. And I imagine she had very specific ideas about how she wished to be remembered. Some people, you know, prefer to control their own narrative, even beyond death." Dr. Haydock looked at her sharply. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting," she said gently, "that Mrs. Hartwell was a woman who had lived with secrets for many years, the sort of woman who might go to great lengths to ensure that those secrets remained buried with her, the sort of woman who might ask her most trusted friends to help her achieve that goal, even if it meant bending certain conventions." The doctor's professional composure cracked slightly. "Some loyalties transcend legal obligations, Miss Marple. When a patient has suffered as Mrs. Hartwell suffered, when she has lived with shame and regret for decades over circumstances beyond her control, sometimes compassion demands that we honour their final wishes, regardless of the consequences to ourselves." Miss Marple nodded with understanding. The war left many people with burdens they couldn't share. Lost loves, broken promises, choices that seemed right at the time but carried lifelong consequences. Mrs. Hartwell was fortunate to have friends willing to help her find peace at last. As she left the surgery, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of relationships that had surrounded Mrs. Hartwell. A wartime romance that had ended in tragedy, a promise made to a dying soldier, and a lifetime of devotion that had culminated in one final act of loyalty. The empty coffin was not a crime born of greed, but a conspiracy born of love, a love so profound that it would risk everything to protect the memory of a woman who had already suffered enough. The truth was emerging like flowers after a long winter, beautiful but fragile, requiring careful tending to survive the harsh light of day. Miss Marple knew that the final revelation would require delicate handling, for sometimes the most important justice was not legal justice, but the justice of understanding and compassion. The morning brought news that transformed the village's understanding of the Hartwell mystery entirely. Miss Marple was arranging her breakfast things when Mrs. Clement arrived, breathless and pale, clutching her shawl as if it were armour against the shocking intelligence she carried. "Jane, something dreadful has happened. Miss Vale, she's gone, vanished in the night from her lodgings. Mrs. Finch found her door standing open this morning, and the room empty, save for a note." Within the hour, Miss Marple found herself accompanying Inspector Slack to the modest boarding-house, where Miss Vale had taken refuge after the funeral's disruption. The inspector's satisfaction was evident as he surveyed what he clearly considered confirmation of his criminal conspiracy theory. "Fled in the night," he declared with grim triumph. "Guilt will drive them to it every time. Mark my words, she's joined her accomplices wherever they've hidden the body. This note confirms it. He held up a single sheet of paper, written in Miss Vale's precise hand. I must go where duty calls me. The final obligations cannot be postponed. May God forgive what love has compelled us to do. She will rest as she deserves. D.V. Miss Marple examined the note with careful attention, noting immediately that while the handwriting remained steady, the paper itself was not Miss Vale's usual correspondence stationery. This was ordinary writing paper from Mrs. Finch's supply, suggesting haste or limited resources, yet the message itself was carefully composed, almost ritualistic in its formality. "Inspector," she observed gently, "I wonder if you've noticed that Miss Vale's room tells a rather different story than simple criminal flight." The small chamber bore unmistakable signs of thorough searching, but not by its occupant. Drawers had been pulled out too far, and contents scattered with the carelessness of someone unfamiliar with the room's organization. Miss Vale's meticulous habits, evident in 15 years of devoted service, would never have produced such disarray. More significantly, her most precious possessions remained untouched. On the small dressing table sat a silver-framed photograph of a young man in military uniform. Lieutenant Arthur Vale, Miss Marple recognized from the letters. Beside it lay a small leather prayer book, worn smooth by constant handling, and a locket containing a pressed rose. These were the treasures a devoted sister would never abandon willingly. Sentimental trinkets, Inspector Slack dismissed. Criminals often leave behind items that might identify them. Miss Marple picked up the prayer book, which fell open naturally to the burial service. A faded rose petal marked the passage, and in the margins someone had written in pencil, "For Arthur, who deserved better. For Constance, who suffered enough." The implications struck her with quiet force. This was not the preparation of someone fleeing in panic, but the careful arrangement of someone completing a sacred mission. The note's language, duty calls, final obligations, spoke not of guilt but of solemn purpose. Dr. Haydock arrived as they were examining the evidence, his usual composure strained by obvious anxiety. Miss Marple watched him survey the disturbed room with the intensity of someone looking for specific items, noting how his relief at finding certain things missing warred with concern for Miss Vale's welfare. "Terrible business," he murmured. "The shock of recent events has clearly affected her judgment severely." "Or clarified it," Miss Marple replied quietly, observing his sharp glance. "Sometimes extreme circumstances force people to act on convictions they've carried for years." Tom Fletcher appeared in the doorway, cap in hand and expression troubled. "Begging pardon, Inspector, but I thought you should know. Miss Vale came by the garden at dawn, spent a long time by the roses, cutting the finest. Blooms seemed to be saying, 'Farewell,' like." This detail crystallized Miss Marple's growing certainty. A woman fleeing in criminal panic would not pause for sentimental flower-gathering, but someone completing a ritual of devotion, honoring promises made to the dead, might well gather roses for a purpose planned long in advance. Mrs. Finch, hovering anxiously in the doorway, provided another crucial detail. She asked particularly for the back entrance, miss, said she didn't wish to disturb anyone, and she took only her small valise, left her good walking shoes and her winter coat. Strange choices for someone planning a long journey. Inspector Slack seized upon this as further evidence of guilty flight, but Miss Marple recognized a different pattern. The missing items, a light coat, a small bag, garden gloves she noticed absent from their usual place, suggested someone preparing for a specific task rather than indefinite exile. As the official search expanded and theories of criminal conspiracy gained momentum throughout the village, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Dorothy Vale's disappearance represented not an admission of guilt, but the final act in a drama of devotion that had been unfolding for decades. The empty coffin, the maintained garden, the wartime letters, and now this carefully orchestrated departure all pointed to a truth far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward theory of theft and deception. The real question was not where Miss Vale had gone, but whether she would complete her mission before the authorities caught up with her, and whether that mission involved protecting the living from truths too painful to bear, or ensuring that the dead finally received the honor they deserved. Walking back through the village in the morning light, Miss Marple reflected on the curious arithmetic of love and loyalty. Sometimes the most elaborate deceptions were born not of greed, but of the simple human need to keep faith with those who could no longer protect themselves. And sometimes, she thought, watching the roses bloom in cottage gardens around her, the most important truths were the ones that remained buried deepest of all. The afternoon following Miss Vale's disappearance found Miss Marple standing once again before the gates of Hartwell House, but this time with a purpose that transcended casual observation. Inspector Slack's frantic search for a fleeing criminal had taken him to railway stations and omnibus routes, but Miss Marple's experience told her that the answers to this mystery lay not in timetables, but in the careful language of soil and stem that only a true gardener could read. She made her way directly to the rose garden, where Tom Fletcher was working with the methodical dedication of a man seeking solace in familiar tasks. His weathered face brightened at her approach, though worry lines remained etched around his eyes. "Terrible business about Miss Vale," he said, straightening from his work among the hybrid teas. "She was as good as gold, that one. Always had a kind word and knew more about roses than anyone I ever met, Mrs. Hartwell included." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Indeed? I had no idea Miss Vale was such an accomplished gardener." "Oh, yes, miss. She was the one who really looked after Mrs. Hartwell's special roses. Would spend hours out here, especially in the evenings, talking to them like they were old friends. Had a way with the difficult varieties that was almost magical." This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the garden's meticulous care. She began her systematic examination with renewed purpose, her experienced eyes reading the subtle signs that others had overlooked. The soil around each prize specimen had been enriched with a specialized mixture that spoke of deep knowledge, not just standard compost, but the precise blend of bone meal, blood meal, and aged leaf mold that produced exhibition-quality blooms. More significantly, she recognized the pruning technique employed throughout the garden. Each cut had been made with surgical precision, angled perfectly to encourage new growth while preventing disease. These were not ordinary gardener's cuts, but the careful application of knowledge that came from years of intimate collaboration. Kneeling beside the Souvenir de la Malmaison roses, Miss Marple examined the ties securing the climbing canes. The green twine was knotted with quick, efficient half-hitches, not a gardener's simple loop, but the neat bandage knots that spoke of nursing training, the same twine that had caught on the coffin handle, tied by the same practiced hands. The soil here felt different beneath her gloved fingers, more disturbed, less compacted than the surrounding earth. She probed gently, noting how the earth gave way with unusual ease. This was not a fresh digging, but an area that had been carefully disturbed and then meticulously restored. Her exploration revealed a faint dusting of lime worked into the soil, not the broad application used for general soil improvement, but the careful, localized treatment that served more specific purposes. Near the potting shed, she discovered the source, a partially used bag of garden lime, its contents scattered with the precision of someone who understood both its gardening applications and its other properties. "Mr. Fletcher," she called softly, "have you noticed any changes to this particular bed recently?" Tom joined her, frowning as he examined the area. "That's odd, miss. The soil's been turned here, but not by me. And look." He pointed to a small brass plant marker she hadn't noticed before. "That's new." "Wasn't there yesterday?" The marker bore an inscription that made Miss Marple's heart quicken. "In loving memory of Lieutenant Arthur Vale, Royal West Kents, 1894 to 1917. His garden lives on." The pieces were falling into place with crystalline clarity. This was not merely a garden, but a living memorial to the love story that had shaped two women's lives for decades. The careful maintenance, the expert knowledge, the fierce devotion, all were part of a sacred trust between Mrs. Hartwell and the sister of the man she had loved and lost. Dr. Haydock's footsteps on the gravel path interrupted her thoughts. He approached with the careful gait of a man who knew he was walking into dangerous territory, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be here alone. The situation is complex. "Indeed it is, Doctor. But I think I'm beginning to understand the true nature of that complexity." She gestured toward the memorial marker. "Mrs. Hartwell made very specific plans for her final rest, didn't she?" His professional composure cracked slightly. "She begged me to help her, not for herself. She was beyond such concerns, but for Dorothy, who had watched her mocked all her life for a love that others called foolishness, for a promise made to a dying soldier." Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding. "And so you provided medical assistance for what was essentially a sacred ceremony, the lime to preserve the soil, the careful preparation, the timing coordinated with the funeral arrangements. We could not bear to see her displayed in that family plot, among people who had never forgiven her youthful defiance. She dreaded the charity inheriting as well, though she had supported it faithfully. She said a gift made in spite was no gift at all." The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself as Miss Marple examined the garden's newest addition, a small border planted with white roses and forget-me-nots. The soil disturbance here was shallow but precise, designed not to conceal a body but to protect something equally precious, the physical tokens of a love that had endured beyond death itself. In the greenhouse, she discovered the propagation bench where dozens of rose cuttings were developing in careful rows. Each cutting was labelled with meticulous care, and among them she found several marked "For the Memorial Garden at St. Bartholomew's, Kent," the location where Lieutenant Arthur Vale was buried. The picture was complete now. Mrs. Hartwell and Miss Vale had planned not just the disposal of a body, but the creation of a living memorial that would honour their shared love while protecting secrets that could still cause pain to the living. The empty coffin had been a necessary deception, but the real ceremony, the true burial of their devotion, had taken place here in the garden they had created together. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on the extraordinary devotion she had witnessed. Two women, bound together by love for the same man, had created something beautiful from their shared grief, and had protected it with the fierce loyalty that only love could inspire. The garden had revealed all its secrets, written in the language of roses and remembrance. Now she understood why Miss Vale had gathered the finest blooms at dawn, not for criminal flight, but for a final ceremony that would complete a promise made decades ago to a dying soldier, and kept faithfully by two women who understood that some obligations transcend death itself. The morning following her discoveries in Mrs. Hartwell's garden, Miss Marple penned several careful invitations in her neat handwriting. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, her modest parlour had been transformed into an elegant setting for what she had described as a small gathering to discuss appropriate memorial arrangements for dear Mrs. Hartwell. The best china gleamed on the tea table, flanked by Mrs. Bantry's contribution of late summer roses and a selection of seed cake that would have done credit to any village fete. Dr. Haydock arrived first, his medical composure intact, but his eyes betraying the wariness of a man expecting difficult questions. Tom Fletcher followed, clearly uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes, but drawn by genuine loyalty to his former employer's memory. Even Inspector Slack had accepted the invitation, viewing it as an opportunity to gather additional intelligence for his case against James Hartwell. "How thoughtful of you all to come," Miss Marple said, settling behind the tea service with practised grace. "One never quite knows how to proceed when traditional arrangements are interrupted. I thought we might discuss some fitting remembrance until matters can be properly resolved." She poured with deliberate care, noting how Dr. Haydock's hands remained steady while Tom Fletcher's weathered fingers drummed nervously against his knee. "Mrs. Hartwell was so devoted to her roses," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "I noticed at the flower show how magnificently they'd been maintained, even after her passing. Such expert care, the sort that comes only from deep knowledge and genuine affection." Tom's eyes brightened with professional pride before clouding with confusion. "That weren't my doing, miss. Haven't touched those roses since Tuesday morning when I left early for the undertaker's. Someone else has been seeing to them proper." "Indeed? How interesting." Miss Marple's knitting needles began their gentle rhythm. I observed the most precise pruning techniques, cuts made on the perfect bias, and those neat little knots securing the climbing canes. Hospital knots, I believe they're called. So much more secure than ordinary garden ties. Dr. Haydock's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. "Hospital knots prevent chafing," he said carefully. "Nurses learn them for securing bandages where the skin is delicate." How practical! I noticed them particularly on the Souvenir de la Malmaison canes, such beautiful specimens. And the soil around them had been treated with lime, hadn't it, Tom? Though I confess I always muddle lime and potash. "Lime keeps soil sweet," Tom corrected automatically. "Potash feeds flower and fruit. You'd never confuse them in practice. Lime leaves a particular scent, and it lightens the earth considerable." Miss Marple smiled approvingly. "Thank you for clarifying that." I'm sure Mrs. Hartwell appreciated such knowledgeable care, though I was puzzled by something we discovered at Hartwell House, a medicine bottle dated after her death. Chloral hydrate, prescribed for sleep. Such a strong preparation. The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Inspector Slack looked up sharply from his notebook, while Dr. Haydock's professional mask finally showed cracks. "Clerical errors occur during stressful periods," the doctor said with careful precision. "The important thing is that Mrs. Hartwell's final days were comfortable." "Oh, I'm certain they were." "She was fortunate to have such devoted care. Miss Vale's nursing experience must have been invaluable. 15 years of loyal service creates bonds stronger than mere employment, doesn't it?" Miss Marple paused to examine a complex stitch in her knitting. "I've been reflecting on funeral customs lately. Such fascinating variations across cultures. Some societies believe the spirit cannot rest unless buried in native soil, surrounded by familiar things. Others hold that true peace comes only when one lies where one was happiest in life." Tom Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Hartwell always said she wanted to rest among her roses. Talked about it often, especially toward the end. Said the family plot was cold ground, full of people who'd never understood her." How poetic! There's something rather touching about choosing one's final resting place based on love rather than convention. Miss Marple's needles never paused. Of course, such arrangements would require careful planning and the assistance of devoted friends willing to honour unconventional wishes. Dr. Haydock set down his cup with deliberate control. "Some loyalties transcend legal obligations, Miss Marple. When someone has lived with private griefs for decades, wartime losses, broken promises, judgments from those who never understood, sometimes compassion demands we honour their deepest wishes." "Indeed. I discovered that Miss Vale had a brother who served in the war, Lieutenant Arthur Vale of the Royal West Kents. He was engaged to a young woman he met while recovering from wounds. Tragic that he died just before the armistice, leaving his fiancée to mourn alone. How fortunate that his sister came to care for her afterward." The revelation hung in the air like incense. Tom Fletcher's eyes widened with sudden understanding, while Dr. Haydock's shoulders sagged as if a long-carried burden had finally shifted. "Miss Vale kept faith," Tom said quietly. "She always did. Never would have left things in a muddle, not her. If she's gone somewhere, it's to finish what was started proper." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Love creates its own obligations, doesn't it? Sometimes the most elaborate deceptions are born not from greed, but from the simple human need to keep faith with those who can no longer protect themselves." As the tea party concluded, and her guests departed with varying degrees of discomfort, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance between justice and compassion. The empty coffin had been merely the visible symbol of a love story that had endured for decades, and tomorrow she would need to decide whether that story deserved protection or exposure. The truth, like her carefully tended knitting, was finally taking its proper shape. The morning following her revealing tea party, Miss Marple requested that Inspector Slack gather the remaining principals at Hartwell House for what she termed a final clarification of the facts. The drawing room, with its windows overlooking the rose garden that had become so central to the mystery, seemed the appropriate setting for truth-telling. Dr. Haydock sat with the rigid posture of a man expecting judgment, while Tom Fletcher clutched his cap with nervous reverence. James Hartwell, released on bail but still bearing the weight of suspicion, studied Miss Marple's serene countenance with desperate hope. Inspector Slack, his notebook ready, wore the expression of someone determined to impose order on what had become an increasingly bewildering case. "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple began, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. "I believe we have all been approaching this mystery from the wrong direction entirely. The empty coffin was indeed part of an elaborate deception, but not the criminal conspiracy you've imagined. It was, rather, an act of profound love, and the fulfillment of promises made decades ago." She paused to examine a particularly complex stitch, allowing the tension in the room to build naturally. "The truth begins with understanding that Mrs. Constance Hartwell and Miss Dorothy Vale were not merely employer and companion, but two women bound together by the deepest possible grief and the most sacred of obligations. The foundation of devotion." Miss Marple looked directly at Dr. Haydock. "Doctor, when you spoke yesterday of some loyalties transcending legal obligations, you were referring to a promise made by Dorothy Vale to her dying brother, Lieutenant Arthur Vale of the Royal West Kents. He was engaged to Constance Hartwell during the war, and when he died just before the armistice, he extracted a promise from his sister that she would care for the woman he loved, who would face the world's judgment alone." Tom Fletcher nodded slowly. "She did love those roses something fierce. Always said they were planted in memory of someone special." "Indeed they were." "The rose garden was a living memorial to Lieutenant Vale, tended with the devotion of two women who had loved him in different ways, one as a brother, one as a fiancé. For 15 years Dorothy Vale kept her sacred promise, caring for Mrs. Hartwell with the dedication of a sister, a nurse, and a guardian of shared memories. The medicine and the garden. The crucial clue lay in that medicine bottle with its impossible date, chloral hydrate prescribed after Mrs. Hartwell's supposed death. But the prescription was not for Mrs. Hartwell at all. It was for Dorothy Vale, who had been suffering from the same heart condition that claimed her brother during the war. Dr. Haydock had been treating her declining health with increasing concern. Dr. Haydock's voice was barely audible. Dorothy collapsed that Tuesday morning while tending the roses. Her heart simply gave out, just as Arthur's had. I could not save her. "And that," Miss Marple continued gently, "is when Mrs. Hartwell made her extraordinary decision. She could not bear the thought of Dorothy dying unrecognized, unmourned by society, buried in a pauper's grave as if her 15 years of devoted service meant nothing. More than that, she realized that Dorothy's death offered her the opportunity to honor both their deepest wishes." The great deception. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked around the assembled group. "Mrs. Hartwell asked Dr. Haydock to sign a death certificate in her name, though it was Dorothy who had died. The funeral arrangements proceeded as planned, but the coffin that arrived at the church was empty because the woman everyone believed to be Mrs. Hartwell, Dorothy Vale, was already resting where she truly belonged." "You mean," Inspector Slack began. "I mean that Dorothy Vale was buried with full honours in the Hartwell family plot, mourned and remembered as Mrs. Constance Hartwell. Meanwhile, the real Mrs. Hartwell took on Dorothy's identity, allowing her to complete their shared mission without the constraints of social expectation or legal obligation." Tom Fletcher's weathered face showed dawning comprehension. "The garden work, the hospital knots, the perfect pruning, that was Mrs. Hartwell doing it all along, but as Dorothy. She knew every plant because she'd planned the memorial garden with Dorothy years ago. The codicil's true purpose, the codicil to the will, was Mrs. Hartwell's masterstroke," Miss Marple explained. "It appeared to punish James for his dissolute behaviour, but its true purpose was far more generous. Mrs. Hartwell knew that if she died and could not be buried in the family plot within 4 days, the estate would pass to the children's home. But she also knew that as Dorothy Vale, she could contest the will's conditions, revealing that the burial had indeed taken place, Dorothy's burial under Mrs. Hartwell's name. James looked confused. "But that would still leave me with nothing." "Not at all, my dear boy." Mrs. Hartwell had prepared a separate document, witnessed by Mr. Simmons, establishing a trust for you that was independent of the will's conditions. She wanted you to inherit, but she also wanted to ensure that Dorothy received the recognition and proper burial she deserved. The codicil was designed to create exactly the confusion that would bring the truth to light, while protecting both women's deepest wishes. The final truth. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. Miss Dorothy Vale or rather, Mrs. Constance Hartwell in her final identity, left yesterday morning not as a fugitive, but to complete the last chapter of their shared story. She has gone to Kent to place roses on Lieutenant Arthur Vale's grave and to ensure that the memorial garden they created together will be maintained in perpetuity. The room fell silent as the full implications settled over them. What had appeared to be theft and deception revealed itself as an extraordinary act of love. Two women honouring each other and the man they had both cherished, creating a solution that gave Dorothy the dignity she deserved, while freeing Mrs. Hartwell to live her final days in peace. Dr. Haydock finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. She made me promise to help her honour Dorothy properly. She said 15 years of devoted service deserved better than an unmarked grave and forgotten name. Inspector Slack closed his notebook slowly. So, there was no crime, no theft, no fraud, just two women keeping faith with each other and with the dead. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. The empty coffin was not evidence of criminal intent, but proof of the most profound loyalty imaginable. Sometimes, Inspector, the law must step aside for justice of a higher kind. As the gathering dispersed, and the truth settled into the quiet corners of the village consciousness, Miss Marple reflected on the extraordinary devotion she had witnessed. The mystery of the empty coffin had revealed not a crime, but a love story that had taken decades to reach its proper conclusion, a testament to the lengths people will go to honour their deepest commitments and protect those they hold most dear. The roses in the garden beyond the window swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, their blooms perfect and eternal, tended by love that transcended death itself. The hours following Miss Marple's revelation brought a peculiar stillness to Hartwell House, as if the very walls were absorbing the weight of truth finally spoken. Inspector Slack sat with his notebook closed, the neat columns of evidence and suspicion rendered suddenly obsolete by the complex reality of human devotion. Dr. Haydock stared out at the memorial garden with the expression of a man who had carried a burden too long in silence. It was James who first broke the contemplative quiet. But where is she now? If Miss Vale is truly my aunt, and my aunt is truly Miss Vale, then where? His question was answered by the sound of wheels on gravel. Through the drawing-room windows they watched a modest motor-cab approach the house with the deliberate pace of someone arriving not in flight, but in resolution. From it stepped a woman in simple travelling clothes, her silver hair arranged with the practical elegance that had characterized Dorothy Vale, but carrying herself with a quiet authority that belonged unmistakably to Constance Hartwell. She entered her former home with the composure of someone completing a long-planned ritual. "I received word that my absence had caused considerable distress," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent that years of assumed servitude had never quite erased. "I could not allow innocent people to suffer for what love compelled us to do." The complete confession. Dr. Haydock rose unsteadily. "Constance, you shouldn't have returned. The risk—" "My dear doctor," she replied with gentle irony, "I am officially dead. What further harm can befall me? Besides, I could not permit James to face charges for our deception, nor allow the village to believe that Dorothy had fled like a common criminal." She took her customary seat by the window, her gaze drifting naturally to the roses beyond. The truth begins with Tuesday morning, when Dorothy collapsed among the memorial roses we had tended together for 15 years. Dr. Haydock worked frantically to save her, but her heart, weakened by the same hereditary condition that claimed her brother Arthur, simply gave out. She died in my arms among the flowers that held all our shared memories. Her voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly. In that moment of grief, I realized that Dorothy would be buried as a servant, her years of devoted care forgotten, her connection to Arthur unrecognized. The thought was unbearable. She deserved the honor and recognition that 15 years of love had earned. Tom Fletcher nodded slowly. She did love those roses something fierce, talked to them like they were old friends. Because they were, Tom. Each variety held memories of Arthur, his favourite colours, the roses he sent during our brief wartime courtship, the ones he mentioned in his letters from France. Dorothy and I had created that garden together as a living memorial to the man we had both loved. The mechanics of deception, Mrs. Hartwell continued, her explanation unfolding with the precision of a plan long contemplated. The solution came with startling clarity. I would take Dorothy's place in death, allowing her to be buried with the honour she deserved. Dr. Haydock was reluctant, but he understood that some obligations transcend conventional ethics. Dr. Haydock's voice was barely audible. I signed the death certificate in your name, though it was Dorothy who had died. The funeral preparations proceeded normally, but we buried Dorothy Vale in the Hartwell family plot, mourned and remembered as Constance Hartwell. And I assumed Dorothy's identity, Mrs. Hartwell continued. 15 years of shared life had made us almost interchangeable to casual observers. We were of similar height and build, both silver-haired, both familiar with, the same routines and relationships. The deception was remarkably simple, really. Miss Marple leaned forward with professional interest. The codicil to your will was particularly ingenious. It appeared to punish James while actually ensuring the truth would eventually emerge. Precisely. I knew that if Constance Hartwell could not be buried within 4 days, the estate would pass to charity. But I also knew that as Dorothy Vale, I could later reveal that the burial had indeed taken place. Dorothy's burial under my name. The resulting confusion would force investigation while protecting both our deepest wishes. Legal resolution and documentation. Within hours of Mrs. Hartwell's confession, Mr. Simmons arrived from London with a leather case full of documents that transformed the mystery into a matter of administrative correction. He produced a sealed letter in Mrs. Hartwell's hand, to be opened upon confusion respecting burial, along with a trust deed executed months earlier. The letter confirmed that James was to receive an independent income sufficient to settle his debts and establish himself respectably, completely separate from the will's conditions. Charity, the letter stated, ought always to be a matter of love, not leverage. Inspector Slack, faced with a crime that was not a crime, and a conspiracy that had benefited only the dead, found himself in the unusual position of documenting a deception that served justice rather than defeating it. There will be corrected entries in the burial register, he announced with gruff dignity. The law may be bent, but it has served a higher purpose. The village's new understanding, as word of the truth spread through St. Mildred's, the community grappled with the revelation that they had lived alongside such profound drama, without ever truly seeing it. The empty coffin, once a symbol of crime, now stood as testament to an extraordinary love story that had unfolded in their midst for decades. The gossip that had once been malicious softened into respectful awe. Mrs. Weatherby for once found herself speechless. Mrs. Dollop declared that anyone who criticised such devotion had no heart. Even the vicar, in his Sunday sermon, spoke of love that transcended conventional understanding. Final peace and resolution. Mrs. Hartwell, for she had reclaimed her true identity in making her confession, spent her remaining days quietly arranging the practical matters that love had complicated. James, overwhelmed by his aunt's generosity and the depth of sacrifice he had never suspected, threw himself into his new employment with determination born of gratitude. The trust ensured his debts were discharged and his future secured, but more importantly, it had revealed the love that had always existed beneath his aunt's stern exterior. A month later, Dr. Haydock received a letter bearing a Kent postmark, written in Mrs. Hartwell's firm hand. She described her quiet life in a cottage near the military cemetery where Arthur lay buried, spoke of the roses she had planted on his grave with cuttings from their memorial garden, and of the peace she had found in finally fulfilling her oldest, most cherished obligations. She enclosed a pressed rosebud, a souvenir de la Malmaison, and a brief note, "Dorothy rests in honour, Arthur's memory lives in flowers, and I have found the peace that comes from promises kept. The garden continues to bloom." Miss Marple, reflecting on the case while tending her own modest roses, considered how the most elaborate deceptions were often born not of greed, but of love so profound it would risk everything to honour those who could no longer protect themselves. The empty coffin had indeed concealed a mystery, but one that revealed the extraordinary depths of human devotion rather than the darkness of human nature. The village of St. Mildred settled back into its familiar rhythms. but with a new understanding that the human heart held secrets more intricate and beautiful than any mystery novel. They had thought they knew their neighbours, but the truth had shown them that love, like the finest gardens, required patience, devotion, and sometimes the courage to break convention in service of deeper truths. In the end, justice had been served, not the justice of courts and legal precedent, but the justice of understanding, compassion, and the quiet recognition that some loyalties transcend the boundaries of life and death. The roses continued to bloom in the memorial garden, tended now by Tom Fletcher with the reverence of one who finally understood their true significance, while somewhere in Kent an old woman found peace in the simple pleasure of keeping faith with those she had loved most deeply. 3 months had passed since the extraordinary revelation of the empty coffin and Saint. Mildred's had settled back into its familiar rhythms with the peculiar resilience that characterized English village life. The autumn light slanted through Miss Marple's cottage windows as she prepared for her morning gardening, selecting the small tools that would help her prepare the rose beds for their winter rest. There was something deeply satisfying about this seasonal ritual, the careful pruning, the protective mulching, the patient preparation for spring's eventual return. As she stepped into her garden, Miss Marple reflected on how the Hartwell case had unfolded like a complex bloom, each layer of truth revealing deeper mysteries beneath. The empty coffin had been merely the outermost petal of a story that reached back decades, involving love, loss, and the extraordinary lengths to which people would go to honour their deepest commitments. The village's new understanding. The scandal had transformed from shocking mystery into a story told with respectful admiration for the devotion it had revealed. Mrs. Weatherby for once found herself speaking of love that transcended convention rather than criticising it. The vicar had preached movingly about promises kept beyond death, and even the most gossip-prone villagers had softened their tongues when discussing the affair. James Hartwell had written from London, his tone steadier and more mature than anyone had expected. His inheritance, freed from the codicil's impossible conditions, had enabled him to discharge his debts and establish himself respectably, but more importantly, it had taught him to recognise the profound love that had always existed beneath his aunt's stern exterior. Tom Fletcher continued to tend the memorial garden at Hartwell House with increased reverence, arriving before breakfast and locking the gate at dusk with the solemnity of a cathedral keeper. A small brass plaque now stood among the roses, "For D.V., who kept faith." Visitors paused to read it, and though they said little, their silence spoke volumes. The lessons of devotion. Working among her own roses, Miss Marple considered how the case had challenged conventional notions of truth and deception. What the village had initially seen as criminal fraud had revealed itself as an elaborate act of love, designed not to steal but to honour, not to deceive, but to ensure that devotion received its proper recognition. She dead-headed spent blooms with the same precision she had observed in Mrs. Hartwell's memorial garden, each cut requiring careful consideration. The parallel to human relationships was unmistakable. Too hasty in judgment, and you damaged future growth. Too tentative in understanding, and you failed to encourage the full flowering of truth. Dr. Haydock had struggled most with the ethical complexities of their deception. His medical training emphasized precision and honesty, yet his human understanding had recognized that sometimes compassion required bending conventional rules. A letter had arrived from Kent the previous week, he had mentioned during his visit, written in Mrs. Hartwell's steady hand. She sounded content, he said, like a woman who had finally set down a burden carried too long. The garden's wisdom. Miss Marple paused to examine a climbing rose that had grown beyond its supports. Sometimes, she reflected, love itself grew beyond conventional boundaries, requiring new structures to contain its extraordinary reach. The memorial garden at Hartwell House had been such a structure, a place where grief could be transformed into beauty, where memory could take living form. The case had taught her much about the language of gardens and how it spoke to those who knew how to read it. The hospital knots that had secured the climbing roses, the precise pruning cuts that revealed years of expertise, the careful use of lime to preserve soil conditions, each detail had told part of the story to those patient enough to listen. Gardens required patience, she reflected, much like understanding human nature. They could not be rushed or forced, but needed time to reveal their full beauty. The truth of the Hartwell case had been similar. It had required careful cultivation, gentle probing, and the wisdom to recognize that the most important revelations often came not from dramatic confrontations, but from quiet observation of how people tended the things they loved. Human nature's seasons. As the afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple completed her tasks and stood back to survey her work. The roses were properly prepared for winter's rest, their roots protected, their growth encouraged for spring's return. Like perennials that appeared to die but returned with renewed vigor, love sometimes required apparent endings to achieve its fullest expression. Mrs. Hartwell and Dorothy Vale had found a way to honor their shared devotion by embracing a transformation that seemed like death, but was actually a form of resurrection. Their bond, forged in shared grief over Lieutenant Arthur Vale and sustained by mutual devotion, had been a powerful force that shaped their entire lives and ultimately their deaths. The village itself had been transformed by the revelation. People looked at their neighbors with new awareness, wondering what depths of devotion might lie hidden beneath conventional facades. The story of the empty coffin had become a testament to the extraordinary capacity for love and sacrifice that could exist in the most ordinary circumstances. Final reflections. As she gathered her tools and prepared to return indoors, Miss Marple reflected that the best mysteries were not those that revealed human wickedness, but those that illuminated human goodness in its most extraordinary forms. The empty coffin had contained not absence but abundance, an abundance of love that had found its perfect expression in the most unlikely of places. The roses would bloom again in spring, she thought, tended by hands that understood their need for both discipline and tenderness. And in Kent, in a small cottage near a military cemetery, an old woman would continue to place fresh flowers on a soldier's grave, keeping faith with promises made long ago and honoured at last. Truth, like the finest gardens, required patience and careful attention to flourish. It could not be forced or hurried, but when it finally bloomed, it revealed beauty that made all the waiting worthwhile. The mystery of the empty coffin had been solved, but its deeper lessons continued to resonate, that love was the most powerful force in human nature, capable of inspiring both the greatest sacrifices and the most ingenious solutions. Miss Marple smiled gently as she closed her garden gate, knowing that somewhere among the ordinary routines of village life, other stories of extraordinary devotion were quietly unfolding, waiting for someone with patience and understanding to recognize their hidden beauty.